Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Kai, and in this installment of the Hadith Holes series, we look at the interplay between Hadith and jurisprudence, or Fiqh. Given that the Quran is supposed to be the pinnacle of divine revelation, Muhammad the exemplar for all mankind, and Islam the only religion accepted by Allah, it is quite strange then that given Islam's extensive preoccupation with legal do's and don'ts, Muhammad never actually left instructions how to derive legal rulings. While Muhammad was alive, people asked him questions and he responded. Then one day he died, and no one knew how to formulate legal rulings. The process of formulating epistemic principles to be utilized in making legal judgments is precisely how Muslims arrive at the various, contradictory jurisprudential schools. In a nutshell, it largely amounts to a bunch of guesswork. Simply identifying epistemic sources, i.e., Quran and Sunnah, does not inform you of methodology how to apply those sources. An example is knowing what verses in the Quran are abrogated. But even this point, which would seem straightforward, can't be agreed upon by Muslims. Despite that Muslims recognize that the Quran contains abrogated verses, there is no consensus among them which verses these are. There are copious other examples one can give apart from this one, but that's beyond the focus of this presentation. Moreover, there is a need for other epistemic sources besides quote-unquote Quran and Sunnah if the existing material in the Quran and Sunnah is deemed insufficient. For example, the need for utilizing an analogy known as qiyas in Arabic, grounded in something that is known to derive a truth about something that is unknown. Different jurisprudential schools exist because each represents a different epistemic framework, namely different epistemic sources, criteria, and methodology how to derive legal rulings expressing the supposed divinely ordained Sharia. This is why you get the plethora of different schools like Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, Laythi, Thawri, Zaydi, Awza'i, Dhahiri, Jariri, to name just a handful among a multitude that have historically existed and have since become extinct. Differences can and do exist within the same school, which are due to differences in application of a common epistemic framework. However, differences between schools are by and large due to competing epistemic frameworks. This is why, historically, scholars insisted that a Muslim must adhere to one jurisprudential school so as to not mix and match different epistemologies by taking from multiple schools. In order to transcend all the schools altogether and exercise complete independence when deriving legal rulings, a scholar must set forth his own epistemic framework. He does not get to say he can do whatever he wants because he is knowledgeable. He certainly does not do what so many Muslims in the modern day do and say that one needs only follow quote-unquote Quran and Sunnah. Following the Quran and Sunnah is not the issue. Rather, it is how the Quran and Sunnah fit into an overall epistemic framework, namely how one identifies and applies information from the Quran and Sunnah. This is where the various jurisprudential schools come into play. When the Quran and Sunnah are not sufficient, then one must rely on other epistemic sources. But alas, differences between the schools, or even opinions within the same school, exist because it is all guesswork, since there are no instructions from Muhammad how to go about formulating legal rulings. And in guessing, Muslims cannot be 100% certain that their epistemic framework represents Muhammad's personal undisclosed methodology, which often simply appears to be him just making stuff up based on his own desires, as Aisha once remarked to the effect that Allah hastens to satisfy Muhammad's wishes. That Islamic law is fundamentally epistemic guesswork, consider the following statement from Imran Ahsan Khan Niazi's book Following a Single School and Rules for Issuing Fatwas, from the section titled In What Cases is the Qawl, or opinion, of the Imam or of the school to be given up? Quote, Al-Haskafi says the following in the opening chapter of his book. If we are asked about our opinions and about the opinions of the rival school, we will say by necessity our opinions are correct with a probability of our error in some cases, and the opinions of our rivals are incorrect with a probability of being correct in some cases." End quote. Since no one school can guarantee it is absolutely 100% correct, by necessity, all have to recognize, or at least tolerate, other schools because of the probability that those other schools may, in fact, be correct. Islamic scholars are very well aware of this epistemic problem, but the Muslim masses, being ignorant of this issue, in order not to doubt in Islam, they are fed the lie and nonsense that differences in Islam are a mercy from Allah. As long as a person holds to the major foundational aspects of Islam, like believing in Allah and Muhammad's prophethood, praying, fasting, giving to charity, and making a pilgrimage to some cube in the middle of the desert, then they are to be reckoned Muslim, irrespective of any secondary differences that exist within the Muslim community at large, or Ummah. The idea is to preserve the overall unity of the Muslim community by not letting differences on secondary matters be grounds for division. In reality, though, this is a massive cope. Differences arise because there is no precisely defined epistemology from which to derive Islamic law. But nevertheless, let's entertain the idea that differences are divine mercy. If that is the case, then by necessity, Muslims are forced to defend the rulings of schools they do not belong to or follow. Basically, a Muslim paints himself into the corner, not being able to escape by simply saying things like, "I don't follow such and such school, therefore I don't have to defend it." Well, in fact, yes you do. If you believe that differences are divine mercy, then you believe the other schools are authentic expressions of the divinely ordained Sharia. So yes, you do have to defend criticisms against schools you do not follow, as those are still part of Islam. In other words, for those of us doing apologetics contra Islam, it is completely valid to criticize any one of the schools as representing authentic Islam, and you as a Muslim have to defend that school whether or not you follow it. That's the problem you Muslims get yourselves into when you take the position that differences are divine mercy. But if you reject the idea that differences are divine mercy, then you still have the problem of epistemic uncertainty. It is impossible to demonstrate which of the schools is authentic. They cannot all be authentic given the plurality of conflicting rulings. If every single situation allows for a plurality of rulings, basically covering the spectrum of possible options, and they all represent authentic Sharia, then you do not really have Sharia. Rather, you have a system that justifiably permits everything. Just pick up any book on comparative jurisprudence, where the legal rulings are compared between the various schools, and it's the same thing over and over and over. Practically every single situation admits to multiple conflicting rulings, all touted as representing authentic positions. For example, to a high degree, the Hanafi school is completely at odds with many of the rulings arrived at by the Shafi'i school, yet both represent authentic Islam. That's not to say the schools never agree on anything, because they do, but rather the degree to which they admit to a plurality of conflicting rulings is such that it is quite literally making the whole jurisprudential venture a complete joke. Likewise, when you read Imam Nawawi's commentary on Sahih Muslim, he frequently discusses how the hadiths are used by the various schools, and also conflicting rulings within the same school, and there you see the same thing over and over and over. Irreconcilable conflicting rulings, all to be taken as authentic expressions of Islam. To give one example, and this example just happens to be what I was reading about at the time of making this presentation, so I didn't go out of my way to select it for any particular purpose other than that's what I had on hand at the time. The discussion is whether or not a person who is in the ritual state of ihram, meaning they have formally initiated the process of making the pilgrimage to Mecca, known as Hajj, and are in a special consecrated state, if such a person can eat animals that have been hunted. The legal judgments are in disagreement. Some legal scholars say that the person may not eat of a hunted animal while in the state of ihram. This prohibition is categorical, across the board. It is a total prohibition. Other legal scholars say that the person may eat as long as he did not participate in the hunting. Each side has its evidential proofs. This example is a simple illustration at how the whole system is just a joke. These two positions on this one issue are mutually exclusive. They cannot both be valid expressions of Sharia. Yet, the uncertain nature inherent to Islamic jurisprudence has to admit to both rulings, even if one can provide a supposed superior explanation why one set of proofs should trump another. And as I said earlier, this is just one example that happened to be the one I was currently reading at the time. But the pattern is the same. Time and time again, over and over and over, you have conflicting, mutually exclusive legal rulings on the same issue, all of which are recognized as authentic expressions of Sharia. This state of affairs is the norm in Islamic jurisprudence and not the exception. Now, let's ask the following question. Did Muhammad provide the criteria how to determine what is authentic? If you answer yes, then you need to provide evidence for this. That's going to be impossible because such evidence does not exist. Well, insofar as we're dealing with Sunni Islam. In Shia Islam, you have the idea of the divinely guided Imam, which we'll get into in a future episode, God willing. So for Sunni Islam, the answer to our question has to be a resounding no. So if you are a Sunni Muslim and you know Muhammad never provided the criteria how to determine what is authentic, then the necessary follow-up questions are, 1, who gets to establish the criteria? And 2, what normative authority can enforce the establishment of this criteria? Take, for example, some very problematic epistemic scenarios Muslims face. These are just examples to illustrate the point. We can give plenty more. If we consider Muhammad's Sunnah as encapsulated by hadiths to be an epistemic source for deriving legal rulings, then how does one satisfactorily resolve the problem that Bukhari requires the narrators of the hadiths that he recorded to have met each other, while Muslim did not? You can't just wave the problem away and say something like, Bukhari was more strict. It's obvious that Bukhari was more strict than Muslim. That's not the point. The point is, why did Bukhari feel the need to be so strict and Muslim did not? That's the epistemic question, irrespective of the contents of the hadiths and their associated chains of transmission. And then you have how the hadiths are utilized, namely one school, the Shafi'i, requiring that a hadith need only be graded quote-unquote sahih, while another school, the Hanafi, requiring that a hadith be both quote-unquote sahih and quote-unquote mashhur, or well-known or popular. Basically, Sunni Muslims face a very steep uphill battle to demonstrate that these epistemic conditions and others like them don't amount to guesswork. To phrase it a simpler way, it's all arbitrary. To phrase it in the most simplest way possible, it's all BS. And with that, we reach the end of this episode, which means we go through a brief summary of the episode's progress thus far in the Hadith Holes series. In the episode Main Reason Muslim is Inferior to Bukhari, we showed that it is not necessary to establish that hadith narrators actually met. In the episode No Eyewitness Testimony Exists, we showed that no hadith manuscripts exist during the lifetime of Muhammad. In the episode Massive Problems with Mass Transmission, we showed that the overwhelming majority of hadiths are not mass transmitted. In this episode, What the Fiqh? we showed that Islamic law is just a bunch of guesswork. Stay tuned for the next episode as we continue to examine Muslim epistemology and normative authority.